few decades ago, Sweden was a symbol of prosperity and safety. However, today, the reality looks entirely different.
Not entitled to remain in Sweden, must leave the country.
Shooting in Sweden, 10 people are now dead.
Mamy do czynienia z upadkiem Europy.
Districts have emerged where the state has started to lose control.
Podobno około 60 takich no-go zone,
No-go zones,
do których policja nie zagląda.
But all of this did not happen overnight. Back in the 1960s, Sweden was an almost homogeneous society. Industry was thriving, unemployment was low, and the welfare state model provided citizens with stability. It was then that the concept of folkhemmet was born, the idea that everyone was supposed to feel like part of one big family. The state guaranteed its citizens safety, high wages, and access to top-tier public services. Politicians were convinced that Sweden could become a model of equality and prosperity for the entire world. The economy was booming, but with that came a growing demand for new workers. The government decided to bring in cheap labor and opened the borders to immigrants. First came the workers from Southern Europe, but in the following decades, they were replaced by migrants from the Middle East and Africa. When crises in those regions escalated in the 80s and 90s, Sweden welcomed thousands of refugees. In theory, this was supposed to work perfectly. Immigrants would fill labor shortages and become part of Swedish society. However, many of them ended up on welfare rather than in jobs, and instead of integrating, they formed isolated communities with no contact with the rest of the country. The authorities ignored the problem, and the media assured the public that everything was going according to plan. The government repeated that integration was a process that takes time. Rinkeby, Tensta, or Rosengård quickly turned into ghettos where the state had almost completely lost control.
Ja na dzień dzisiejszy nie czuję się tutaj bezpiecznie I już...
I, for one, do not feel safe here, and I'm already on my way to leaving this country altogether, moving somewhere else for the sake of my children.
By the early 21st century, the problems had become too big to hide. Unemployment rates among immigrants hit record highs. Schools struggled with children who didn't speak Swedish, and crime in these districts skyrocketed. Anyone who dared to say something was wrong was immediately accused of racism. That was when the biggest mistake was made. Instead of addressing the issue at its root, the government chose to continue ignoring it. And when in 2015, Angela Merkel opened Europe's borders to a wave of migrants, Sweden became one of the main destinations. Over 160,000 refugees in a single year, more than ever before. The authorities kept insisting that everything was under control, but the reality was quite different. Sweden simply couldn't cope with such a massive influx of new residents, and in places that were supposed to be symbols of integration, exclusion zones emerged instead. No one wanted to admit that migration on this scale had shattered the country's social cohesion. More and more unemployed, more and more people dependent on state benefits, and finally, more and more young men who, instead of building a future in a new country, chose a life in gangs. That was the road leading to what we see today. Sweden was finally forced to admit it had a problem, but by then, it was far too late. Gangsters took over entire districts. The police were afraid to intervene, and bombings became an everyday occurrence.
I just wanted to quickly clarify that bombings in Sweden really are a daily reality. Just in January of this year, there were about 30 explosions, an average of 1 bomb per day. These figures come directly from Swedish police statistics. And just before the release of this film, another tragic event took place, a school shooting in Örebro. Just to be clear, the attacker in this case was a native Swede. It feels like so much is happening in this country that it's hard to keep up with the news. And we're talking about Sweden, once one of the safest countries in the world.
Violence knows no borders, and more often, innocent people are caught in the crossfire of gang wars. In one incident, a 39-year-old Polish man was brutally murdered simply because he confronted a group of teenagers. He was shot in front of his own child.
It was an execution so unbelievable, so brutal and horrific that we have seen such things somewhere in South America or in countries where this crime is not civilized.
This is just one of many examples showing that today in Sweden, ordinary people can no longer feel safe, neither on the streets nor in their own homes. But it's not just about murders. Sexual crimes in Sweden have also reached record levels. Over 8,000 reported rapes in 2022. And that's only the cases that were actually reported. Many victims never come forward. For comparison, In Poland, a country with 4 times Sweden's population, there were over 6 times fewer reported rapes in the same period. Statistically, the risk of being a victim of rape in Sweden is over 25 times higher than in Poland. And when we look at the perpetrators, the data speaks for itself. In 2018, a Swedish police report revealed that 58% of those convicted of rape were born outside of Europe.
Det jag har fått till mig nu på morgonen då, det är att vi har en kollega då som har blivit beskjuten och sedermera då avlidit utav sina skador. För det vore för jäkligt rent ut sagt att man riktar ett vapen mot någon som ska hålla samhället i ordning på något sätt. Jag tror att det här har med den här konflikten att göra som vi har sett tidigare här i de här områdena.
How much more evidence is needed to openly admit that the Swedish model of openness has failed? This didn't happen by accident. Violence is no longer just an isolated problem in a few districts. Gang wars are being fought not only in Malmö or Göteborg, but also in smaller cities that were once considered peaceful. If anyone still doubts what's happening in Sweden, just look at the case of Salwan Momika, this Iraqi immigrant, who became famous for burning the Quran during public protests, believed that in a democratic country, freedom of speech was guaranteed. But he was gravely mistaken. On January 29th, 2025, he was shot dead in his apartment. The police are investigating, but everything suggests that his death was an execution. This was not just a crime, it was a sentence. Authorities are examining possible links to foreign states, but one thing is certain. Sweden is no longer a country where one can feel safe. And what are the politicians doing?
Det som bara inte får hända har nu hänt, även i Sverige. Vi har idag sett ett brutalt dödligt våld mot helt oskyldiga människor. Det här är den värsta masskjutningen i svensk historia.
The Prime Minister speaks of a war on crime, yet the Minister of Justice warns that the fight will take decades. But no one has a plan to stop the chaos. Because how do you fix something that was ignored for years? How do you reclaim a country that politicians simply gave away? When crime exploded and society began losing patience, politicians finally decided to act, but their solutions look more like panic than a real strategy.
Take the money and leave, please. The Swedish government is offering to pay immigrants $34,000 if they go back to their home country.
This bizarre initiative is one of the most absurd solutions proposed so far. Instead of solving the problem, the government wants to pay people to leave, using taxpayer money. Initially, they offered 10,000 Swedish kronor, but barely anyone took the offer. In an entire year, only one person accepted it. In response, the government raised the payout to 350,000 Swedish kronor, around $34,000. This sum is equal to 10 years of wages in many North African or Middle Eastern countries. Some speculate that this could even become a business model. Arrive, then collect welfare, and then take the payout and leave. For now, this is just a proposal, as the budget for this program hasn't been approved yet. The funds are set to increase in 2026, but by then the situation could worsen even further. Paying people to leave is just one part of Sweden's new approach. The country is now introducing the strictest migration laws in its history. In 2024, Sweden accepted only 6,000 refugees, more than 6 times fewer than just a few years ago. Permanent residence is now only granted to those who learn Swedish and find a job. Welfare benefits have been restricted, no more automatic access to social aid. The first target of these changes was the police, which was granted new powers to conduct searches in so-called security zones, districts with the highest levels of criminal activity.
In less than 2 years, there's been a dramatic increase in so-called no-go zones across the country. The number of what Swedish officials call vulnerable areas has now reached 61.
This is meant to increase control over gangs, but coincidentally these zones almost perfectly align with areas predominantly inhabited by migrants. Accusations of racism and xenophobia emerged immediately, but the government decided that there was no other choice. However, this was not enough, as the police are unable to handle the violence and the open gang wars. That is why the military was deployed. Armed soldiers began patrolling the streets, something that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. At the same time, the government promised to deport criminals. Anyone who is not a Swedish citizen and commits a serious crime should be expelled. Sounds good, But in practice, more than half of those convicted remain in the country. Why? Because their home countries refuse to take them back. Iraq, Somalia, and Afghanistan, these nations do not want their citizens to return, and Sweden has no tools to force them. In 2023, Sweden issued 18,000 deportation orders, yet only 6,000 people actually left the country. The rest stayed, and Sweden has no idea what to do with them. Gangsters who should have been deported simply return to the streets after a short prison sentence and resume their criminal activities.
Moreover, the means by which to expel foreign citizens who, for example, are involved with criminal, violent, or extremist organizations will be improved.
As we can see, the Swedish government has taken action, but instead of a thought-out strategy, what we have is a chaotic mix of police operations, soldiers on the streets, and failed deportation attempts. The official statistics are brutal. Sweden has changed beyond recognition. In the 1980s, immigrants from outside Europe made up just a few percent of Sweden's 10 million population. Today, over 20% of Sweden's residents have a migrant background. In the largest cities, the numbers are even more shocking. And this is just the beginning. Birth statistics show that in the next few decades, Sweden will change irreversibly. The average number of children per woman among native Swedes is around 1.7, which is below the replacement level. Among some migrant groups, the birth rate is much higher, even 3 or more children per woman. If this trend continues, ethnic Swedes will become a minority in their own country. But even now, the effects of this transformation are visible. Schools and kindergartens in major cities struggle with children who don't speak Swedish at all, making education increasingly difficult. And what about the rest of Europe? While Sweden was opening its borders for years, other European countries were doing the same. Germany, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands all repeated the same mantra that migration was an opportunity and that integration was just a matter of time. Angela Merkel in 2015 famously said, "Wir schaffen das."
Ich sage ganz einfach, Deutschland ist ein starkes Land und das Motiv, in dem wir an diese Dinge herangehen, muss sein, wir haben so vieles geschafft, wir schaffen das.
Now, Germany is in crisis, and the government openly admits that its integration model has failed. France? Same story. Mass migrant protests, riots on the streets of Paris, and attacks on the police have become everyday occurrences. Exclusion zones are growing, and President Emmanuel Macron has announced a tougher migration policy. Too bad it's only happening now, when the situation is already out of control. Belgium, the epicenter of radical Islam in Europe, Molenbeek, labeled a breeding ground for jihadists, has become a symbol of what happens when the state loses control. Many of the terrorists who carried out attacks in Europe came from Belgium.
You look at what's happening last night in Sweden. Sweden, who would believe this? Sweden. They took in large numbers. They're having problems like they never thought possible.
But some countries said no from the very beginning. Viktor Orbán, long criticized by Brussels, sealed the borders, built a fence, and refused to accept refugees. And yet, somehow Hungary doesn't seem to have issues with mass crime. Despite pressure from the European Union, the Polish government also built a barrier on the border with Belarus. These countries were criticized and accused of lacking solidarity, of xenophobia, of so-called nationalism. And now, these countries watch as Europe falls apart before our eyes. Why does Poland not have districts where the state has lost control? Because from the very beginning, they knew that security is fundamental, not a topic for negotiation. How exactly did Poland handle the migration crisis? You can learn more about it in the video currently displayed on your screen.